Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a question that sounds almost absurdly specific until you realize it shaped how millions of people lived for centuries. How many candles were you allowed to burn in your home on any given night? The answer wasn't up to you. In countless communities across medieval and early modern Europe, candle use was regulated with a precision that would make modern building codes look casual. And the reason? The deadly, devastating, civilization-threatening reason was fire. This is the story of how the simple act of lighting your home after dark became a matter of collective survival, and what that tells us about how communities manage shared risk. The medieval city was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. This isn't metaphor, it's architectural reality. Buildings were constructed primarily of wood, with thatched roofs that dried to perfect kindling every summer. Streets were narrow, sometimes barely wide enough for two people to pass, which meant that flames could leap from one building to the next with terrifying ease. A fire that started in a single room could consume an entire district in hours. London burned catastrophically in 1135, again in 1212, and most famously in 1666. Paris burned repeatedly. Rouen, Hamburg, Copenhagen, the list of medieval cities destroyed or nearly destroyed by fire reads like a directory of European urban centers. The statistics, where they survive, are staggering. The Great Fire of London destroyed 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and most of the city's public buildings over 4 days. But London's 1666 catastrophe, dramatic as it was, represented just one particularly well-documented instance of a phenomenon that was essentially routine. Smaller fires, fires that destroyed only a neighborhood or two, that killed only dozens rather than hundreds, happened constantly. Fire was the background radiation of medieval urban life, an ever-present danger that shaped behavior, architecture, law, and social organization in ways we've largely forgotten. The causes of these fires were various, but domestic lighting ranked near the top of every list. Candles were the primary source of artificial light for most households, and candles were inherently dangerous. An unattended candle could ignite nearby fabric, paper, or wooden surfaces. A candle knocked over by a child, a pet, or a careless adult could start a blaze before anyone noticed. A candle burning too close to a ceiling beam could smolder for hours before bursting into flame. And candles were everywhere, in every room, at every hour of darkness, multiplied across thousands of households in every city. Before we continue, let me ask something. If you're the kind of person who finds yourself fascinated by how ordinary objects became matters of life and death regulation, you're exactly who I make these for. Take a moment to subscribe if that sounds like you, and tell me in the comments, have you ever thought about how dangerous pre-electric lighting actually was? I'm genuinely curious whether this is something people consider or whether we've just forgotten entirely. The response to this persistent fire danger took many forms, but one of the most interesting and least remembered was the candle quota. Towns across Europe developed regulations specifying exactly how many candles a household could burn simultaneously, where those candles could be placed, what times of day or night candle use was permitted, and who was responsible for ensuring compliance. These weren't informal suggestions or community guidelines. They were laws, enforced through inspections, fines, and sometimes more severe penalties. The right to illuminate your own home was not a given. It was a privilege granted within strict limits. The logic behind candle quotas was straightforward: risk multiplication. One candle in one home represented a certain probability of fire. 2 candles doubled that probability. 10 candles multiplied it tenfold. Across a city of 10,000 households, each additional candle permitted represented thousands of additional fire sources burning simultaneously. The collective risk wasn't simply the sum of individual risks, it was potentially much worse, because fires that started in one location could spread to neighbors, creating cascading failures that overwhelmed firefighting capacity. Limiting candles at the household level was a way of managing systemic risk at the city level. The specific quotas varied enormously by location, time period, and household status. In some German towns, ordinary households were limited to 2 candles after the evening curfew bell. In some Italian cities, the limit was tied to room size or household occupation. Workshops might be permitted more candles than residences on the theory that productive work justified additional risk. Wealthy households sometimes purchased exemptions or higher quotas, paying for the privilege of more light while contributing to firefighting funds that would address the increased danger they created. The enforcement of candle quotas required intrusive surveillance of domestic space. Town watches didn't just patrol streets. They looked into windows, counted visible flames, and reported households that exceeded their allotments. In some communities, designated inspectors made rounds of homes, verifying that candle use conformed to regulations. The privacy implications were significant. Your evening activities were visible to authorities in ways that modern citizens would find uncomfortable, but the alternative was watching your city burn. The physical evidence of candle regulation survives in unexpected forms. Some medieval buildings still bear marks indicating approved candle positions, small niches or holders built into walls at specific locations where candles could be safely placed. These weren't decorative, they were regulatory. A candle in an approved holder was legal. A candle elsewhere might not be. The architecture itself encoded the rules about acceptable fire risk, creating built environments that channeled behavior toward safety. Candle holders themselves evolved in response to fire regulation. The development of enclosed lanterns, which contained flames within glass or metal housings, was partly driven by regulatory requirements that open flames be contained. Snuffers, which allowed candles to be extinguished without blowing, which could scatter sparks, became standard equipment, partly because regulations required their use. The material culture of domestic lighting was shaped by the legal framework surrounding fire risk. The timing regulations were often as specific as the quantity regulations. Many communities prohibited candle use after certain hours, requiring households to extinguish all flames by a specified time. This wasn't just about sleep schedules. It was about concentrating fire risk into periods when people were awake and alert to respond. A fire that started at midnight when households were sleeping could grow unnoticed for precious minutes. A fire that started at 8 in the evening, when people were still active, would likely be spotted and addressed immediately. Timing regulations pushed candle use towards safer hours. The seasonal variations in candle regulations reflected the change in fire risk across the year. Winter months, when heating fires were necessary and dry conditions often prevailed indoors, typically saw stricter candle limits than summer months. The combination of heat-and fires and candle flames created compound risks that warranted additional caution. Some communities adjusted their quotas monthly or even weekly, tracking conditions that affected fire danger and modifying permitted candle counts accordingly. The economic implications of candle quotas were substantial. Candles weren't cheap. They represented a significant expense for ordinary households, and limiting their use meant limiting an important category of consumption. Households that wanted more light had to either violate regulations, risk in fines, or find alternative solutions. This created markets for safer lighting technologies, oil lamps that burned more controllably than candles, rushlights that were dimmer but less dangerous, and eventually the enclosed lanterns that would become standard. The candle trade itself was affected by quota systems. Candle makers whose products were subject to strict limits had incentives to produce longer burning, safer candles that provided more value within the permitted quotas. Quality mattered more when quantity was constrained. This pressure toward quality improvement was an unintended benefit of regulation. By limiting how many candles people could burn, quotas encouraged the development of better candles. The social dimensions of candle quotas reveal a great deal about medieval conceptions of collective responsibility. The regulations assumed that individual household decisions about lighting created risks for the entire community, that your candle burning in your home endangered your neighbors in ways that justified public intervention. This wasn't an abstract philosophical position, it was lived experience. Everyone knew someone who had lost their home, their possessions, or their family members to fires that started in neighboring buildings. The case for collective regulation was written in ash and grief. The enforcement challenges were significant. How do you actually verify that a household is burning only its permitted number of candles? The watch could observe from the street, but interior rooms weren't visible. Inspectors could enter homes, but this required either cooperation or legal authority to compel entry. Many households undoubtedly exceeded their quotas on occasions when they thought they wouldn't be caught, calculating that the risk of fine was worth the benefit of additional light. The regulations worked not because they achieved perfect compliance, but because they reduced overall candle use enough to matter. The penalties for quota violations varied, but could be severe. Fines were common, calibrated to be painful enough to deter violation without being so harsh as to seem unjust. Repeat offenders faced escalating penalties. In some communities, households that caused fires through quota violations faced additional liability for damages to neighbors. You weren't just fined for having too many candles, you were held responsible for the consequences of the fire your excess candles caused. This liability regime created strong incentives for compliance. The relationship between candle quotas and other fire regulations was complex. Most communities had multiple overlapping systems for fire prevention, building codes specifying materials and construction methods, chimney regulations requiring regular cleaning and inspection, storage rules limiting how much flammable material could be kept in particular locations, and the candle quotas governing domestic light-in. These systems interacted in ways that weren't always coherent. A household might comply perfectly with candle regulations while violating building codes in ways that made their home particularly vulnerable to fire. Comprehensive fire safety required attention to all these dimensions simultaneously. The institutional structures for fire prevention evolved alongside candle quotas. Many towns developed specialized fire wardens whose responsibilities included monitoring candle use as part of broader fire prevention duties. These wardens were community officials, often appointed or elected, who represented collective interest in fire safety. They had authority to enter homes, issue citations, and, in emergencies, take immediate action to address fire risks. The warden system created a cadre of officials whose job was specifically to worry about fire, freeing other community members to focus on their own affairs while trusting that someone was watching. The firefighting capacity of medieval communities also shaped how candle quotas were set. Towns with better firefighting resources, more water access, better organized response teams, superior equipment, could arguably tolerate higher fire risk and thus more permissive candle quotas. Towns with minimal firefighting capacity needed stricter prevention because they couldn't rely on effective response. The quotas reflected not just the probability of fire starting, but the probability of fire spreading once started, which depended heavily on response capabilities. The psychological dimensions of living under candle quotas deserve attention. Modern people experience darkness differently than medieval people did, in part because we can banish it at will. A medieval household limited to 2 candles after curfew experienced genuine darkness for much of their evening hours. This wasn't merely inconvenient. It shaped what activities were possible, how space was used, and when people slept. The candle quota defined the boundary between light and dark, between activity and rest, in ways that reached deep into daily life. The adaptation strategies that households developed were ingenious. Families learned to concentrate activities in single rooms where the permitted candles could provide adequate light, rather than spreading across multiple spaces that would each require illumination. They timed their activities to make maximum use of daylight hours, reserving candlelit hours for tasks that absolutely required them. They developed techniques for working in dim light that modern people would find challenging. The constraints became normal, and behavior adapted to fit within them. The class dimensions of candle quotas were unavoidable. Wealthy households could afford to pay for higher quotas, to install safer lighting infrastructure, and to absorb fines if they chose to violate regulations. Poor households faced the full force of limitations without the resources to mitigate them. The dark homes of the poor were dark not just because they couldn't afford more candles, but because regulations prevented them from burning more even if they could. This was sometimes justified as protecting the poor from their own fire risk. Their wooden tenements were particularly vulnerable. But it also represented a form of imposed darkness that reinforced social hierarchy. The religious dimensions were also present. Churches were typically exempt from candle quotas, and the dramatic illumination of religious spaces stood in stark contrast to the dim homes of congregants. This contrast was sometimes interpreted theologically, the church as a beacon of light in a dark world. But it was also a practical regulatory choice. Churches were built of stone, had high ceilings that dissipated heat, and were staffed by personnel trained in candle safety. The risk calculation was different, justifying different treatment. The guild system intersected with candle quotas in complex ways. Craftsmen who required good light for detailed work, goldsmiths, scribes, tailors working fine fabrics, often received occupational exemptions or elevated quotas. Their economic value to the community justified accepting higher fire risk from their workshops. But these exemptions created tensions. Why should a goldsmith burn 5 candles while his neighbor, the baker, was limited to 2? The exemptions were defensible on economic grounds, but created resentment and accusations of favoritism. The documentary evidence for candle quotas comes from diverse sources: municipal ordinances that specified the regulations, court records that documented violations and penalties, household inventories that listed candle stocks and lighting equipment, and narrative accounts that described how regulations were experienced. Piecing together this evidence reveals systems that were more comprehensive and more consistently enforced than casual readers might expect. Candle quotas weren't paper rules that everyone ignored. They were living regulations that shaped daily behavior. The evolution of these systems over time reflected changing conditions and change in understanding. Early regulations were often crude, simple prohibitions or one-size-fits-all limits. Later regulations became more sophisticated, with graduated quotas based on household characteristics, seasonal adjustments, and exception procedures for special circumstances. The regulatory systems matured as communities gained experience with what worked and what didn't, developing the kind of institutional knowledge that allows complex problems to be managed effectively. What candle quotas reveal, ultimately, is how pre-modern communities thought about shared risk and collective action. They understood that individual choices aggregated into collective outcomes, that your freedom to light your home affected my safety and mine, that the city itself was a shared resource that everyone had an interest in not burning down. They developed sophisticated institutional responses to these insights, creating regulatory frameworks that modern observers might not expect from supposedly primitive societies. The systems weren't perfect, fires still happened, regulations were still violated, enforcement was still inconsistent, but they represented genuine attempts to solve genuine problems. The fire continues to burn in the hearth, but the candle quotas are calling. The next part of our story will explore how these systems actually operated in practice, what happened when they failed, and what the decline of candle quotas tells us about how societies transition from one approach to risk management to another. The darkness outside is growing, and our permitted candles are burning low. Let's continue. The practice of candle quotas didn't exist in isolation. It was embedded in broader systems of community fire prevention that included everything from building materials regulations to organized firefighting responses. Understanding how candle quotas actually functioned requires understanding this larger context, the web of practices, institutions, and assumptions within which household lighting regulation made sense. The story of candle quotas is really the story of how pre-modern communities learned to manage catastrophic risk through collective action, and what happens when those systems are tested by actual catastrophe. Consider the city of Nuremberg in the 15th century, one of the most thoroughly documented examples of comprehensive fire prevention. Nuremberg's regulations covered an extraordinary range of fire-related behaviors: how chimneys must be constructed, how often they must be cleaned, where heating fires could be placed, how much kindling could be stored in a household, and yes, how many candles could be burned and where. The candle regulations were specific: no more than 3 candles after the evening bell in ordinary households, with the candles required to be placed in approved holders at least 2 arm lengths from any wooden surface or fabric. Violations were punishable by fines that increased with each offense. The enforcement apparatus in Nuremberg was equally sophisticated. Fire wardens conducted regular inspections, entering homes without advance notice to verify compliance with all fire regulations, including candle limits. These inspections happened several times per year for most households, more frequently for those with previous violations or those engaged in high-risk occupations. The wardens kept records of their findings, creating what amounts to a fire safety database that tracked compliance across the city. Households that consistently violated regulations faced escalating consequences, up to and including eviction from the city. The physical inspection process reveals how seriously these regulations were taken. Wardens didn't just count visible candles, they examined candle holders for signs of improper use, checked the proximity of storage materials to potential ignition sources, and assessed the overall fire safety of each dwelling. They were looking for patterns of behavior, not just momentary violations. A household found with 4 candles burning might receive a warning. A household found with improper candle placement near flammable materials, combined with a history of other violations, might face serious penalties. The record-keeping aspect deserves emphasis. Medieval communities are often imagined as administratively primitive, but the fire prevention records from places like Nuremberg reveal sophisticated bureaucratic systems. Wardens documented their inspections in standardized formats, enabling comparison across time and identification of problem households. These records were used in enforcement proceedings, with past violations cited as aggravating factors in penalty decisions. The system had institutional memory, which made it far more effective than ad hoc enforcement could have been. The economic incentives embedded in the system were carefully designed. Fines for candle quota violations were calibrated to exceed the benefit of having additional light, making compliance economically rational. For wealthy households, the fines needed to be higher to create meaningful deterrence. For poor households, even small fines created hardship. Some communities experimented with proportional fines, scaled to household wealth, attempting to create equivalent deterrent effects across economic classes. The goal was making violation consistently unprofitable, regardless of who was violating. The relationship between candle quotas and the candle supply itself was complex. Candle makers were a regulated trade in most medieval cities, with guilds that controlled production quality and quantity. The quotas on candle use created an interesting dynamic. Limiting demand should have limited the market for candles, but in practice, the quotas created demand for higher quality candles that burned longer and more safely within the permitted limits. Guild regulations increasingly specified quality standards that aligned with fire safety goals, creating mutually reinforcing systems of regulation. The seasonal variation in candle quotas reflected sophisticated understanding of how fire risk changed across the year. Winter months saw not just shorter days requiring more artificial light, but also dry indoor conditions, more heating fires, and greater use of stored fuels, all factors that increased fire risk. Summer months featured longer daylight hours and reduced need for artificial lighting, but also different risks. Dry outdoor conditions that could help fires spread between buildings, and activities like food preservation that involved open flames. The quotas adjusted accordingly, with winter limits often stricter than summer limits, despite greater need for light. The interface between household regulations and commercial establishments created particular challenges. Taverns, workshops, and shops all required lighting for their business operations, often during hours when residential candle use was prohibited. The solution in most communities was a separate regulatory track for commercial premises, with different quotas, different inspection schedules, and different penalty structures. A tavern might be permitted 12 candles, while neighboring residences were limited to 2, on the theory that the commercial establishment's economic value justified accepting higher risk, and that its staff was trained in fire safety in ways that ordinary household members were not. If you're finding this exploration of medieval fire regulation fascinating, if you can see the parallels to how we regulate risk in modern societies, that's exactly why I make these videos. The subscribe button is there if you want more of these moments where history suddenly illuminates the present. The failure modes of candle quota systems were instructive. When fires did occur despite regulations, communities conducted investigations to understand what had gone wrong. Sometimes the answer was simple non-compliance. A household had exceeded its quota and a fire resulted. Sometimes the answer was compliance with one regulation but violation of another, proper candle numbers but improper placement. Sometimes the answer was that the regulations themselves were inadequate. Properly placed candles in approved holders could still start fires under certain conditions. These investigations fed back into regulatory revision, creating cycles of improvement. The great urban fires that devastated medieval cities sometimes prompted dramatic regulatory responses. After London's devastating fire of 1212, which killed thousands, The city implemented stricter candle regulations alongside requirements for stone construction in certain areas. After Rouen fire of 1200, which destroyed much of the city center, similar regulatory intensification occurred. These catastrophic events served as focusing events, creating political will for measures that might otherwise have been resisted as intrusive or expensive. Crisis enabled reform. But regulatory intensification after disasters was often temporary. The immediate aftermath of a great fire saw enthusiastic enforcement and widespread compliance. As years passed and memory faded, enforcement relaxed and violations crept back. This pattern, crisis, reform, relaxation, repeat, characterizes fire regulation across centuries. Communities struggled to maintain vigilance in the absence of recent disaster, gradually accepting risks that earlier generations had sworn to prevent. The candle quotas that seemed essential immediately after a fire seemed burdensome a decade later. The role of insurance in candle quota systems is worth examining, though insurance itself was only beginning to develop during the medieval period. In some Italian cities, neighbors were held collectively responsible for fire damage within their district, creating a form of mutual insurance that gave everyone a stake in everyone else's fire safety compliance. If your neighbor's candle started a fire that damaged your home, you had standing to seek compensation, but you also had responsibility for any fire that started in your home and spread to theirs. This mutual liability regime reinforced the candle quotas by adding civil consequences to the criminal penalties for violation. The architecture of urban space itself was shaped by fire regulation in ways that affected how candle quotas functioned. The narrow streets that characterized many medieval cities were fire hazards, allowing flames to jump easily between buildings. But they also enabled surveillance. From street level, wardens could observe candles burning in upper-story windows, identifying potential violations. Wider streets reduced fire spread, but also reduced observability. The urban form and the regulatory system co-evolved, each shaping the other. The social enforcement of candle quotas may have been even more significant than official enforcement. Neighbors who observed each other violating candle limits had strong incentives to report those violations. Not out of spite, but out of legitimate fear that their own homes were endangered. The communal nature of fire risk created communal enforcement mechanisms. A household that consistently burned too many candles faced not just official penalties, but social disapproval from neighbors who understood that their own safety was compromised. This social pressure was probably more consistent and more effective than periodic official inspections. The relationship between candle quotas and social order extended beyond fire safety. The regulations gave authorities legitimate reason to enter and inspect homes, creating surveillance opportunities that could be used for purposes beyond fire prevention. A warden inspecting for candle violations might also observe illegal activities, suspicious visitors, or evidence of moral transgressions. The fire safety rationale provided cover for broader social control. This dual function was sometimes explicit. Fire wardens were also tasked with reporting other violations, and sometimes implicit but clearly understood. The gender dimensions of candle quota enforcement reflected broader patterns of household responsibility. Women were often held responsible for domestic fire safety, including candle use, reflecting their roles as household managers. When violations occurred, women were frequently the ones penalized, even when men in the household might have been equally or more responsible. This gendered enforcement reinforced women's subordinate position while also recognizing their actual authority over domestic matters. The home was women's domain, and fire safety within that domain was women's responsibility. The religious calendar intersected with candle quotas in complex ways. Major religious celebrations often involved exceptional illumination, Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days, and these celebrations created tension with fire safety regulations. Communities typically granted explicit exemptions for religious occasions, permitting increased candle use on specified holy days. But these exemptions were themselves regulated. The additional candles were to be used in specific ways, for specific purposes, and for limited durations. Religious celebration was permitted, but not at the cost of abandoning fire safety entirely. The development of alternative lighting technologies was influenced by candle quota systems in ways that accelerated technological change. Oil lamps, which burned vegetable or fish oils, provided light with somewhat different risk profiles than candles. Some communities regulated oil lamps separately, with different quotas reflecting different risk assessments. The comparison between candle and lamp regulations drove experimentation with both technologies, as producers sought to develop lighting options that could provide more illumination within regulatory limits. Enclosed lamps, which contained flames within protective housings, emerged partly from this regulatory pressure. The geographical variation in candle quota systems reflected different local conditions and different regulatory philosophies. Northern European cities, with their longer winter nights and greater heating fire use, generally had stricter candle limits than Mediterranean cities, where darkness was shorter and heating fires less necessary. Cities built primarily of stone could tolerate higher fire risk than cities built primarily of wood. Wealthy trading cities with extensive firefighting resources regulated differently than poor agricultural towns with minimal response capacity. There was no universal standard. Each community developed regulations suited to its particular circumstances. The enforcement of candle quotas against travelers and newcomers created particular challenges. Permanent residents knew the local regulations and were embedded in the social networks that informally enforced them. Travelers passing through might have no idea what the local candle limits were and might unknowingly violate regulations that seemed arbitrary from the perspective of their home communities. Some cities posted regulations at gates or required innkeepers to inform guests of fire rules. Others simply held travelers to the same standards as residents, whether they knew the rules or not. The treatment of outsiders revealed how communities balanced fire safety against hospitality. The documentary record preserves individual stories of candle quota enforcement that bring the system to life. In 1423, a Nuremberg widow named Kunigunde was fined for burning 4 candles while doing needlework after the evening bell, one more than her permitted 3. Her defense was that the work required good light and she was trying to finish before morning. The court acknowledged her situation but upheld the fine, noting that individual hardship couldn't justify collective risk. Kunigunde's case illustrates how the system worked. Sympathetic circumstances didn't override the regulations because the regulations existed precisely to prevent the aggregation of individual choices into collective danger. Another documented case from Florence in 1456 involved a workshop that caught fire after an apprentice knocked over a candle. Investigation revealed that the workshop had been operating with 6 candles, twice the permitted number for its size. The workshop owner was held liable not just for the fire damage, but for the violation that enabled it. His defense, that the detailed work required additional light and that he had always used 6 candles without incident, was rejected. The lack of previous fires didn't make the violation acceptable. It just meant he'd been lucky until his luck ran out. The interaction between candle quotas and building construction standards reveals how comprehensive fire prevention systems had to be. Strict candle limits in buildings constructed of highly flammable materials might achieve less fire reduction than lenient candle limits in buildings with fire-resistant features. The smartest regulatory systems recognized this interaction and calibrated candle quotas based on building characteristics. A stone building with a tile roof might be permitted more candles than a wooden building with thatch because the consequence of a candle-related fire was less severe. This risk-based approach anticipated modern building code practices by centuries. The decline of candle quota systems happened gradually, driven by multiple factors that we'll explore fully in our final section. But understanding why the systems eventually disappeared requires appreciating how thoroughly they functioned during their peak. These weren't vestigial regulations maintained through bureaucratic inertia. They were active, enforced systems that genuinely reduced fire risk. Their eventual replacement by other approaches, better building codes, professional fire departments, and eventually electric lighting, didn't reflect the failure of candle quotas. It reflected changing conditions that made different approaches more effective. The persistence of candle quotas across centuries and across diverse communities suggests they solved real problems that other approaches couldn't easily address. Before professional fire departments, communities had to rely primarily on prevention because response capacity was limited. Before building codes could require fireproof construction, communities had to limit ignition sources because they couldn't eliminate flammable materials. Before electric lighting, candles were both necessary and dangerous, and managing their use was unavoidable. The quotas represented a sensible response to the constraints of the time. What the candle quota systems teach us, ultimately, is that pre-modern communities were capable of sophisticated collective action in response to shared risks. They could design regulations, build enforcement systems, and sustain compliance over extended periods. They could balance individual liberty against collective safety in ways that weren't perfect but were functional. They could learn from failures and improve their approaches over time. The systems had flaws: inequitable enforcement, privacy intrusions, limited effectiveness against determined violators, but they also had genuine achievements: fewer fires, less destruction, more lives saved than would have occurred without regulation. The fires still burn in the distance, but we've learned how communities tried to prevent them. The final part of our story will explore the decline of candle quotas, the lessons their disappearance offers about regulatory transitions, and what this history reveals about how societies change their approaches to managing collective risk. The candle is burning low, and soon we'll be in darkness. Let's continue before the flame goes out. The decline of candle quota systems didn't happen through dramatic repeal or revolutionary rejection. It happened the way most regulatory systems end, through gradual obsolescence, as the conditions they addressed changed faster than the regulations themselves could adapt. The story of how candle quotas disappeared is as instructive as the story of how they functioned, because it reveals the dynamics of regulatory transition that repeat across different domains and different eras. The first factor in the decline was technological change in lighting itself. Gas lighting, which began spreading through urban areas in the early 19th century, fundamentally altered the relationship between illumination and fire risk. Gas burned differently than candles, more consistently, more controllably, and in fixed locations determined by pipe infrastructure rather than user choice. A home lit by gas didn't need candle quotas because it didn't have candles, or had them only for backup and special occasions. The regulatory framework designed for candlelit homes became irrelevant in gaslit homes. The transition wasn't immediate or uniform. Gaslighting reached wealthy neighborhoods and commercial districts first, then gradually extended to middle-class areas, and only much later to working-class neighborhoods. During this extended transition, some households lived under the old candle regulations while their neighbors operated under entirely different systems. The candle quotas persisted longest in the areas that modernized most slowly: rural communities, poor urban neighborhoods, and regions where infrastructure investment lagged. The social meaning of candle quotas shifted during this transition in revealing ways. Regulations that had once applied to everyone now applied only to those who couldn't afford modern lighting. The quotas became markers of economic status, associated with backwardness and poverty rather than with prudent fire prevention. Compliance became stigmatizing rather than respectable. This shift undermined the social enforcement that had made the quotas effective. Neighbors no longer reported violations because reporting marked them as participants in an outdated system. Electric lighting completed what gas lighting had begun. By the early 20th century, electricity had spread widely enough that candle use became genuinely optional for most households. Candles became decorative or ceremonial objects rather than primary lighting sources. The fire risk from occasional candle use was vastly lower than the risk from constant reliance on candles, making household-level quotas seem disproportionate to the problem they addressed. The regulatory apparatus that had been essential when everyone burned candles nightly became absurd when candles were used primarily for birthday cakes and romantic dinners. The institutional apparatus of candle quota enforcement had already atrophied before formal repeal in most jurisdictions. Fire wardens who had once inspected homes for candle violations redirected their attention to other fire risks: heating systems, electrical wiring, chemical storage. The specialized knowledge of candle fire prevention that inspectors had maintained became less valuable and was gradually lost as older officials retired without training replacements. The bureaucratic machinery rusted from disuse before anyone bothered to officially dismantle it. The formal end of candle quotas, where it was recorded at all, often came as part of broader regulatory modernization efforts. Cities reviewing their municipal codes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries found candle regulations that no longer made sense and removed them. This housekeeping happened quietly, without fanfare, because the regulations had already ceased to matter in practice. The repeal was recognition of accomplished fact rather than policy change. Some vestigial candle regulations persisted remarkably late in certain contexts. Nursing homes and hospitals, where fire risk remained elevated and vulnerable populations couldn't escape easily, sometimes maintained restrictions on candle use into the mid-20th century. Theaters and public assembly spaces similarly restricted open flames long after private homes had been deregulated. These contextual survivors revealed that the underlying logic of candle quotas, limiting ignition sources and high-risk settings, remained valid, even as general application became inappropriate. The replacement systems for managing fire risk differed fundamentally from the candle quota approach. Rather than limiting ignition sources at the point of use, modern fire safety focused on reducing the consequences of ignition. Fire-resistant building materials, sprinkler systems, smoke detectors, professional fire departments capable of rapid response. The strategic shift was from prevention through behavioral restriction to mitigation through technological and institutional response. You could burn as many candles as you wanted if your building had sprinklers. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this exploration of how regulatory systems rise, function, and fall has changed how you think about the rules that govern our lives, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and share your thoughts. What parallels do you see between candle quotas and contemporary regulations? What risks do we manage collectively today that future generations might find as quaint as we find candle limits? I read every single comment, and I'm genuinely curious what resonates. The shift from prevention to mitigation had significant distributional implications. Candle quotas, whatever their flaws, applied to everyone and required no capital investment to comply with. You simply burned fewer candles. Modern fire safety systems require investment in buildings, equipment, and professional services that falls unevenly across economic classes. A wealthy homeowner with a sprinklered mansion and monitored smoke detectors faces minimal fire risk. A poor family in a substandard apartment with no working smoke detectors faces risk comparable to or worse than medieval households. The democratization of fire risk management through candle quotas was replaced by stratification through technology. The professional fire departments that emerged during the 19th century changed the calculation about acceptable fire risk in fundamental ways. When fire response meant neighbors with buckets, prevention was essential because response was ineffective. When fire response meant trained professionals with pumped water and eventually motorized equipment, some fires could be allowed to start because they could be stopped before becoming catastrophic. The existence of effective response capacity justified relaxing prevention requirements. Communities could accept more ignition risk because they had reduced spread risk. The insurance industry also transformed the fire risk landscape in ways that affected candle quotas. Medieval mutual liability systems gave everyone a stake in preventing neighbors' fires. Modern fire insurance individualized that stake. Your policy covered your losses. Your neighbor's policy covered theirs. The collective dimension of fire risk, which had driven community-wide candle regulation, was partially privatized into individual insurance relationships. If your house burned because of your candles, that was between you and your insurance company, not a matter for community regulation. The privatization of fire risk had important feedback effects on fire prevention behavior. Medieval households knew that their candle use affected their neighbor's safety, which created social pressure toward compliance. Modern households understood that their fire risk was largely their own problem, which reduced the social enforcement that had supplemented official regulation. The loss of collective consciousness about fire risk accompanied the decline of collective regulation. The urban form itself evolved in ways that reduced the systemic dimension of fire risk. The narrow streets and densely packed wooden buildings of medieval cities created conditions where one fire could destroy a neighborhood. Modern building codes requiring setbacks, fire breaks, and fire-resistant construction meant that fires were more likely to remain contained to single structures. The cascading, community-wide fire disasters that had motivated candle quotas became rare enough to seem historical curiosities rather than realistic threats. But the elimination of candle quotas didn't eliminate fire risk. It shifted and transformed that risk in ways that weren't always immediately apparent. The gas lighting that replaced candles brought its own fire hazards. Gas leaks, explosions, and fires that burned hotter than candle flames. The electric lighting that replaced gas brought different hazards. Electrical fires that could smolder in walls before breaking through, overloaded circuits that sparked into flame. Each lighting technology brought a different risk profile that required different regulatory responses. The pattern of regulatory lag that characterized the candle quota era persisted into new technological contexts. Gas lighting spread faster than gas safety regulation, leading to a period of elevated fire risk before appropriate rules were developed. Electrical systems similarly outpaced electrical codes, creating decades when fire risk from electrical sources was inadequately managed. The lesson of candle quotas, that fire risk from new technologies requires regulatory attention, was repeatedly relearned as each new technology emerged. Contemporary fire regulations operate on entirely different principles than candle quotas, but they serve fundamentally similar purposes. Building codes specify fire-resistant materials and construction methods. Occupancy limits restrict how many people can be in a space, partly to ensure evacuation is possible during fire emergencies. Smoke detector requirements mandate early warning systems in residences. These regulations, like candle quotas, accept that fire risk cannot be eliminated, but can be managed through collective rules that constrain individual behavior. The comparison between candle quotas and modern fire regulations reveals both continuity and change in how societies approach collective risk. The continuity lies in the basic principle. Individual choices about fire-related behavior create risks that affect others, justifying collective regulation. The change lies in the specific approaches, from limiting ignition sources to mitigating ignition consequences, from community surveillance to professional inspection, from citizen enforcement to governmental regulation. The underlying problem persists, the solutions evolve. The lessons of candle quotas extend beyond fire regulation to general principles about managing shared risk. The quotas worked when they addressed a genuine problem, when enforcement was feasible, when social norms reinforced official rules, and when the costs of compliance were bearable. They declined when the problem they addressed diminished, when enforcement became impractical, when social norms shifted against them, and when alternative approaches became more effective. These dynamics apply to any regulatory system, not just fire prevention. Contemporary society faces collective risk problems that echo the fire risk that motivated candle quotas. Climate change, pandemic disease, financial system stability, these all involve individual behaviors that aggregate into collective consequences, creating rationales for regulation similar to the rationale for candle limits. The specific regulatory approaches differ enormously, but the underlying challenge is the same. How do you constrain individual choices to protect collective welfare without becoming unduly intrusive or ineffective? The candle quota systems offer some instructive lessons for contemporary risk regulation. First, community involvement in enforcement matters. The social pressure that supplemented official inspection was probably as important as the inspections themselves. Second, regulatory calibration to actual risk matters. Quotas that were too strict were resented and violated, while quotas that were too lenient failed to achieve their purpose. Third, regulatory systems need to evolve as conditions change. The decline of candle quotas followed from failure to adapt to changing lighting technology. Fourth, equity in enforcement matters. Systems that fell disproportionately on the poor lost legitimacy and effectiveness. The memory of candle quotas has largely faded from public consciousness. Few people today know that their ancestors lived under detailed regulations governing how many candles they could burn in their own homes. This forgetting is partly a consequence of the quota's success. The fire disasters that motivated regulation happened infrequently enough that each generation had less direct experience of catastrophe than the one before. The regulations that prevented disasters were eventually seen as unnecessary because the disasters they prevented didn't happen. This paradox of successful prevention regulations that work are perceived as unnecessary affects many domains beyond fire safety. The physical traces of candle quota systems have mostly disappeared. The approved candle holders built into medieval walls were removed during renovations or destroyed when buildings were demolished. The records of inspections and penalties are preserved only in scattered archives, of interest mainly to specialists. The lived experience of operating within candle limits, the constant awareness of fire risk, the strategic allocation of permitted candles, the anxiety when approaching quota limits is entirely foreign to modern life. We have lost touch with a way of experiencing domestic space that was universal for centuries. What we've gained by losing candle quotas is obvious. Freedom to illuminate our homes as we choose, without surveillance or restriction. What we've lost is less obvious, but perhaps equally significant: the lived experience of collective responsibility for shared risk, the daily practice of subordinating individual preference to community welfare, the social relationships built through mutual enforcement of protective rules. Modern society manages fire risk through technology and institutions rather than through community norms and collective vigilance. This is probably more effective in preventing fires, but it may be less effective in building the social bonds that collective action creates. The broader meaning of the candle quota story lies in what it reveals about the possibility of collective action in response to shared problems. Medieval communities, often dismissed as primitive or disorganized, created and sustained sophisticated regulatory systems that protected their members from catastrophic risk. They did this without modern bureaucracy, without professional regulators, without the information technology that modern governance relies upon. They did it through community norms, social pressure, and institutions adapted to their particular circumstances. If they could manage fire risk collectively, perhaps we can manage our collective risks as well. The candle quotas also reveal something about the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare that remains contested today. The regulations required accepting constraints on personal behavior, on what you did in your own home, with your own property, at your own risk, for the sake of community safety. This trade-off was accepted because the alternative was watching your city burn. Modern societies face similar trade-offs, though the specific risks and the specific constraints differ. The question of when individual freedom must yield to collective welfare has no permanent answer. Each generation must negotiate it anew. The fire has burned down to embers. The candles that once required counting and regulating are now museum curiosities or romantic accessories. The elaborate systems that governed their use have been replaced by systems we barely notice: smoke detectors that beep when batteries run low, fire sprinklers that hide in ceilings, insurance policies that arrive in the mail. We live in a world where fire risk has been dramatically reduced through technology and institutions that operate largely without our active participation. This is progress, but it's also a loss. The loss of a particular kind of engagement with shared problems that our ancestors experienced daily. What candle quotas teach us, finally, is that the past was neither as simple nor as chaotic as we often imagine. People who lived centuries before us faced problems we can recognize, developed solutions we can admire, and created institutions that worked well enough to protect their communities through dangerous times. Their specific solutions, the quotas, the inspections, the penalties, are no longer relevant to our lives. But the underlying insight that motivated those solutions, that individual choices about risky behavior create collective consequences that justify collective regulation, remains as true today as it was when the first fire warden counted the candles burning in a medieval home. The darkness outside your window tonight is illuminated by electric lights that would have seemed miraculous to ancestors who carefully rationed their permitted candles. But the fire risk hasn't entirely disappeared. It's been transformed, managed differently, distributed differently. Somewhere, perhaps, a smoke detector's beeping, a fire sprinkler is waiting, a fire department is ready to respond. The collective systems that protect us from fire have changed completely, but the need for collective systems hasn't changed at all. We are still, in our way, counting candles. And with that, our story concludes. Thank you for spending these hours exploring how a simple object, the candle, became the focus of elaborate regulatory systems that shape daily life for centuries. The light has changed, but the darkness remains. Until next time, stay safe, stay warm, and remember, someone, somewhere is still watching to make sure the fire doesn't spread.